Chapter 6 of the Oregon Trail. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Oregon Trail by Francis Parkman, Jr. Chapter 6. The Platte and the Desert. We were now arrived at the close of our solitary journeyings along the St. Joseph's Trail. On the evening of the 23rd of May, we encamped near its junction with the old legitimate trail of the Oregon emigrants. We had ridden long that afternoon, trying in vain to find wood and water, until at length we saw the sunset sky reflected from a pool encircled by bushes and a rock or two. The water lay in the bottom of a hollow, the smooth prairie gracefully rising in ocean-like swells on every side. We pitched our tents by it, not however before the keen eye of Henry Chatillon had discerned some unusual object upon the faintly defined outline of the distant swell. But in the moist, hazy atmosphere of the evening, nothing could be clearly distinguished. As we lay around the fire after supper, a low and distant sound, strange enough amid the loneliness of the prairie, reached our ears: peals of laughter, and the faint voices of men and women. For 8 days we had not encountered a human being, and this singular warning of their vicinity had an effect extremely wild and impressive. About dark, a sallow-faced fellow descended the hill on horseback, and splashing through the pool, rode up to the tents. He was enveloped in a huge cloak, and his broad felt hat was weeping about his ears with the drizzling moisture of the evening. Another followed, a stout, square-built, intelligent-looking man, who announced himself as leader of an emigrant party encamped a mile in advance of us. About 20 wagons, he said, were with him. The rest of his party were on the other side of the Big Blue, waiting for a woman who was in the pains of childbirth, and quarreling meanwhile among themselves. These were the first emigrants that we had overtaken, although we had found abundant and melancholy traces of their progress throughout the whole course of the journey. Sometimes we passed the grave of one who had sickened and died on the way. The earth was usually torn up and covered thickly with wolf tracks. Some had escaped this violation. One morning a piece of plank standing upright on the summit of a grassy hill attracted our notice, and riding up to it we found the following words very roughly traced upon it, apparently by a red-hot piece of iron: Mary Ellis, died May 7th, 1845, aged 2 months. Such tokens were of common occurrence. Nothing could speak more for the hardihood, or rather infatuation, of the adventurers, or the sufferings that await them upon the journey. We were late in breaking up our camp on the following morning, and scarcely had we ridden a mile when we saw far in advance of us, drawn against the horizon, a line of objects stretching at regular intervals along the level edge of the prairie. An intervening swell soon hid them from sight, until, ascending it a quarter of an hour after, we saw close before us the emigrant caravan, with its heavy white wagons creeping on in their slow procession, and a large drove of cattle following behind. Half a dozen yellow-visaged Missourians, mounted on horseback, were cursing and shouting among them, their lank, angular proportions enveloped in brown homespun, evidently cut and adjusted by the hands of a domestic female tailor. As we approached, they greeted us with the polished salutation, "How are you, boys? Are you for Oregon or California?" As we pushed rapidly past the wagons, children's faces were thrust out from the white coverings to look at us, while the careworn, thin-featured matron, or the buxom girl seated in front, suspended the knitting on which most of them were engaged, to stare at us with wondering curiosity. By the side of each wagon stalked the proprietor, urging on his patient oxen, who shouldered heavily along, inch by inch, on their interminable journey. It was easy to see that fear and dissension prevailed among them. Some of the men, but these with one exception were bachelors, looked wistfully upon us as we rode lightly and swiftly past, and then impatiently at their own lumbering wagons and heavy-gaited oxen. Others were unwilling to advance at all until the party they had left behind should have rejoined them. Many were murmuring against the leader they had chosen, and wished to depose him, and this discontent was fermented by some ambitious spirits who had hopes of succeeding in his place. The women were divided between regrets for the homes they had left, and apprehension of the deserts and the savages before them. We soon left them far behind, and fondly hoped that we had taken a final leave; but unluckily our companion's wagon stuck so long in a deep muddy ditch that, before it was extricated, the van of the emigrant caravan appeared again descending a ridge close at hand. Wagon after wagon plunged through the mud, and as it was nearly noon, and the place promised shade and water, we saw with much gratification that they were resolved to encamp. Soon the wagons were wheeled into a circle, the cattle were grazing over the meadow, and the men, with sour, sullen faces, were looking about for wood and water. They seemed to meet with but indifferent success. As we left the ground, I saw a tall slouching fellow with the nasal accent of "down east" contemplating the contents of his tin cup, which he had just filled with water. "Look here, you," he said, "it's chock full of animals." The cup, as he held it out, exhibited in fact an extraordinary variety and profusion of animal and vegetable life. Riding up the little hill and looking back on the meadow, we could easily see that all was not right in the camp of the emigrants. The men were crowded together, and an angry discussion seemed to be going forward. R. was missing from his wonted place in the line, and the captain told us that he had remained behind to get his horse shod by a blacksmith who was attached to the emigrant party. Something whispered in our ears that mischief was on foot. We kept on, however, and coming soon to a stream of tolerable water, we stopped to rest and dine. Still the absentee lingered behind. At last, at the distance of a mile, he and his horse suddenly appeared, sharply defined against the sky on the summit of a hill, and close behind, a huge white object rose slowly into view. "What is that blockhead bringing with him now?" A moment dispelled the mystery. Slowly and solemnly, one behind the other, 4 long trains of oxen and 4 emigrant wagons rolled over the crest of the declivity and gravely descended, while R. rode in state in the van. It seems that, during the process of shoeing the horse, the smothered dissensions among the emigrants suddenly broke into open rupture. Some insisted on pushing forward, some on remaining where they were, and some on going back. Kearsley, their captain, threw up his command in disgust. "And now, boys," said he, "if any of you are for going ahead, just you come along with me." 4 wagons, with 10 men, 1 woman, and 1 small child, made up the force of the "go ahead" faction, and R., with his usual proclivity toward mischief, invited them to join our party. Fear of the Indians, for I can conceive of no other motive, must have induced him to court so burdensome an alliance. As may well be conceived, these repeated instances of high-handed dealing sufficiently exasperated us. In this case, indeed, the men who joined us were all that could be desired, rude indeed in manner, but frank, manly, and intelligent. To tell them we could not travel with them was of course out of the question. I merely reminded Kearsley that if his oxen could not keep up with our mules, he must expect to be left behind, as we could not consent to be further delayed on the journey. But he immediately replied that his oxen should keep up, and if they couldn't, why, he allowed that he'd find out how to make 'em. Having availed myself of what satisfaction could be derived from giving R. to understand my opinion of his conduct, I returned to our side of the camp. On the next day, as it chanced, our English companions broke the axle-tree of their wagon, and down came the whole cumbrous machine, lumbering into the bed of a brook. Here was a day's work cut out for us. Meanwhile our emigrant associates kept on their way, and so vigorously did they urge forward their powerful oxen that, with the broken axle-tree and other calamities, it was full a week before we overtook them, when at length we discovered them, one afternoon, crawling quietly along the sandy brink of the Platte. But meanwhile various incidents occurred to ourselves. It was probable that at this stage of our journey the Pawnees would attempt to rob us. We began, therefore, to stand guard in turn, dividing the night into 3 watches, and appointing 2 men for each. Delorier and I held guard together. We did not march with military precision to and fro before the tents. Our discipline was by no